E.M. Bounds prayed at 4 a.m. for over 40 years and heaven took notice. While the world slept, while churches grew busy with activity and noise, one man rose before dawn to do the work few were willing to do. No crowds, no applause, no platform, just a chair, a Bible, and hours spent wrestling with God in silence. E.M. Bounds believed something most people only say they believe, that prayer is not preparation for the work, but the work itself. He didn't build a movement in his lifetime. He didn't become famous. Yet decades after his death, his words on prayer continue to confront pastors, unsettle churches, and awaken hungry souls across the world. What kind of life produces that kind of power? What happens when prayer is taken seriously at any cost? Before we dive into the full story, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's hungry for deeper faith. Then stay with us because this story may change how you see prayer forever. Before the world stirred, before church bells rang or sermons were written, before sunlight touched the windowsills of quiet towns, one man was already awake. At 4 o'clock in the morning, year after year, decade after decade, E.M. Bounds rose from his bed, not driven by habit, but by hunger. A hunger not for recognition, not for applause, not even for productivity in the way the modern world understands it. He rose because he believes something with terrifying seriousness, that prayer moves the hand that moves the world. But this discipline did not begin in strength. It was forged in obscurity, suffering, disappointment, and a slow, relentless surrender to God. Edward McHenry Bounds was born in 1835 in Shelby County, Missouri, a frontier land still forming its identity. America itself was young, restless, and conflicted. The nation was expanding westward, yet fracturing inwardly. Slavery, civil unrest, and political division cast long shadows over everyday life. It was into this unsettled world that Bounds entered, not as a prodigy, not as a mystic, but as a bright, ambitious young man with a sharp mind. In his early years, there was little to suggest he would become one of the most piercing voices on prayer the church has ever known. Bounds studied law. He trained his intellect rigorously, mastering argument, structure, persuasion. Words mattered to him. Logic mattered. Order mattered. He was intelligent, articulate, and poised for success. By all outward appearances, his future lay in courts and civic influence, not in the quiet agony of prayer closets. And yet, beneath the polished exterior, something restless stirred. The same discipline that made him an excellent legal mind began to trouble him spiritually. He could argue cases, but could he wrestle with God? He could persuade men, but could he prevail in prayer? The turning point came not with thunder or visions, but with conviction. Bounds abandoned law and entered the ministry, believing God had claimed his life entirely. He was ordained in the Methodist Episcopal Church, South, stepping into pastoral work with sincerity and zeal. But zeal alone does not sustain a soul. Bounds soon discovered that ministry, stripped of prayer, becomes hollow, even dangerous. Then came the crucible. The American Civil War erupted, tearing the nation apart. Bounds served as a chaplain to Confederate soldiers. He did not watch the war from a distance. He lived in its blood-soaked proximity. He ministered to wounded men, prayed with the dying, and preached hope amid despair. He saw faith tested not in theory, but in terror, and the war did not spare him. Bounds was arrested by Union forces and imprisoned. He suffered deprivation, isolation, and uncertainty. The systems he trusted collapsed. The nation fractured. The church struggled. And the young minister learned a lesson that would mark him forever. Everything visible can be shaken. In prison, stripped of routine, stripped of control, stripped of comfort, Bounds turned inward and upward. Prayer was no longer an accessory to ministry. It became survival. When he was released and returned to pastoral life, he was no longer the same man. Something had shifted. He had tasted dependence. He had seen how powerless sermons were without spiritual weight. He had felt how thin religious activity becomes when it is not soaked in prayer. Yet, Bounds did not immediately become the man history would remember. Years followed years. a faithful but largely unnoticed ministry. He pastored small congregations, he edited church publications, he wrote diligently, his sermons were sound, his theology was orthodox, his life was respectable, and he was deeply dissatisfied. Bounds watched the church grow increasingly busy and increasingly shallow. He saw ministers become administrators, organizers, entertainers. He saw prayer meetings shrink while programs expanded. He saw confidence in human methods rise as dependence on God quietly withered, and it disturbed him. He began to ask dangerous questions. Why did the early church shake cities while modern churches barely stirred consciences? Why did preaching once carry fire while now it often carried information? Why did revival stories belong to the past, spoken of with nostalgia rather than expectation? Bounds did not conclude that God had changed. He concluded that the church had slowly, deliberately. He returned to the one place most neglected: secret prayer, not public prayer, not performative prayer, but the unseen, uncelebrated work of meeting God before anyone else was awake. 4 a.m. became sacred ground. While others slept, Bounds prayed, not for minutes, but for hours, not occasionally but daily, not when convenient but when costly. This was not mysticism, it was warfare. He prayed through scripture. He prayed over sermons before he wrote them. He prayed for the church by name, for revival by name, for holiness by name. He prayed until words failed and silence spoke. He prayed when he felt nothing. He prayed when answers delayed. And slowly, imperceptibly, his theology began to crystallize. He became convinced that God's greatest work is done through men who pray. Not men who plan brilliantly, not men who speak eloquently, not men who are strategically gifted, but men and women who prevail with God in secret. Bounds wrote privately at first. His words were sharp, uncompromising, almost unsettling. He did not flatter preachers. He challenged them. He warned that sermons born in study, but not in prayer, were powerless. He insisted that no amount of learning could replace intimacy with God. Yet during his lifetime, almost no one listened. He published little. He gained no fame. He pastored quietly. He prayed relentlessly. When Bounds died in 1913, his name was scarcely known beyond small church circles. There were no crowds, no monuments, no widespread recognition, but hidden among his personal papers were manuscripts, raw, urgent, uncompromising reflections on prayer. They would be discovered later, and when they were, the church would realize something astonishing. This quiet man, who rose at 4 a.m. for over 40 years, had been doing something few dared. He had been contending with God for the soul of the church. And in doing so, he had shaken heaven. For a .m is an unforgiving hour. It is the hour when excuses feel reasonable, when the body protests, when silence presses in with almost physical weight. It is the hour when no one is watching, no one applauding, no one recording. For most, it is the hour of sleep. 4 a.m. Bounds, it became the hour of encounter. This was not accidental. It was intentional, chosen, guarded. Bounds believed that the quality of a man's public ministry could never rise above the depth of his private prayer life. And if prayer was to be more than religious formality, if it was to be power, then it demanded the best hours, not the leftovers. He chose the morning not because it was romantic, but because it was costly. Before letters were written, before sermons were prepared, before the world intruded with its urgencies. Bounds met God. These mornings were not hurried devotions. They were extended seasons of wrestling. He read scripture slowly, meditatively, often aloud. He lingered over phrases. He prayed them back to God. He allowed the word to interrogate him before he ever dared to speak it to others. Prayer, to Bounds, was not an escape from work. It was the work. He rejected the growing idea already present in his time that prayer was valuable only insofar as it supported real ministry. For him, prayer was not a tool. It was the engine. Everything else was secondary. And this conviction reshaped how he saw ministers. Bounds was unsparing in his assessments. He did not attack character lightly, but he was ruthless about priorities. He observed that many ministers were intelligent, educated, even sincere yet spiritually thin. They trusted schedules more than supplication. They leaned on rhetoric more than reliance. They filled pulpits with words, but neglected the altar that gave words weight. In his journals, he wrote with fire, "A preacher who does not pray is preaching without power. A church that does not pray is working without God." These were not slogans. They were conclusions drawn from decades on his knees. The 4 a.m. altar was where his theology was purified. There, he learned that prayer is not primarily about asking, it is about alignment. The longer he prayed, the more his desires were stripped, refined, and sometimes dismantled. He entered prayer with lists. He often left with repentance. He came seeking answers. He frequently received correction. Bounds understood something many never grasp. Prayer changes the one who prays before it ever changes circumstances. This is why his mornings endured for over 40 years, not because they were easy but because they were necessary. There were seasons of dryness, long stretches where heaven felt silent, moments when fatigue screamed louder than faith. Yet Bounds persisted. He believed that delayed answers were not divine indifference, but divine training. He wrote that God often withholds immediate results because he's more interested in shaping the intercessor than solving the problem. This belief gave him endurance. Prayer, for Bounds, was not measured by emotional intensity, but by faithfulness. He showed up whether he felt inspired or empty. He prayed when sermons succeeded and when they fell flat. He prayed when churches grew and when they stagnated. And slowly, his mornings produced fruit, though rarely the kind the world celebrates. He did not become famous. He did not lead mass movements. He did not headline conferences. Instead, something quieter happened. His preaching gained weight, not volume weight. His words carried conviction beyond technique. His sermons lingered in consciences longer than memory could explain. People sensed something different. Bounds was not theatrical. He was not flamboyant. But there was gravity about him, a seriousness that came not from temperament, but from proximity to God. And still, he remained largely unseen. This hiddenness became part of the work. Bounds came to believe that God deliberately hides his most powerful servants, not because they are insignificant, but because publicity often corrupts prayer. He observed how quickly acclaim erodes dependence, how subtly success replaces supplication. So he stayed hidden. While others wrote books to be noticed, Bounds wrote journals meant only for God. While others networked, he interceded. While others slept, he prayed. And these mornings began to shape his most dangerous idea yet. He concluded that revival is not God's problem, it is the church's prayer problem. God, he believed, was always ready, always willing, always powerful. The shortage was never in heaven. It was on earth among those who claimed to serve him, which refused the cost of sustained prayer. This idea burned in him, but it sharpened his pen. When Bounds finally began to organize his thoughts into manuscripts, they were not gentle reflections, they were indictments. He accused the church not with bitterness, but with grief. He warned that talent without prayer would produce noise, not transformation. He insisted that methods could never substitute for men who knew God deeply. Yet even then, he did not rush to publish. Bounds was suspicious of haste. He believed truth matured slowly. He allowed his ideas to be tested by years of obedience before he released them. His 4 a.m. mornings were the proving ground. By the time his manuscripts were complete, they were not theoretical. They were embodied. Every sentence had been prayed. Every warning had been lived. Every conviction had cost him sleep, comfort, and recognition. Still, the world remained mostly unaware, and that, strangely, was part of the design, because the power of Bounds was never meant to be rooted in personality or platform. It was meant to be rooted in prayer, quiet, unseen, relentless. Bounds did not write like a man trying to impress. He wrote like a man trying to warn. By the time his pen began to move with urgency, the fire had already burned through decades of prayer. These were not ideas gathered from bookshelves or lectures. They were convictions pressed into him in the silence of early mornings, when the only audience was God himself. Bounds wrote slowly, painstakingly, often in longhand. His notebooks were filled not with polished prose, but with raw, searching reflection, sentences sharpened by struggle, paragraphs heavy with burden. He wrote as one who had seen something precious neglected, and could not remain silent. What disturbed him most was not outright unbelief in the church, but functional unbelief. Men still preached Christ. Churches still opened their doors. Prayer was still mentioned, sometimes eloquently. But Bounds saw that prayer had been subtly displaced. It had been reduced to a prelude, a transition, a formality, something to begin services, not to sustain lives. And he believed the consequences were catastrophic. Bounds argued that the church's greatest crises were not theological, but spiritual. Not a lack of truth, but a lack of power. The gospel had not weakened, but the instruments through which it was proclaimed had grown dull. Why? Because prayer had been margi and alised. In his writings, Bounds made one claim repeatedly, relentlessly, and without apology: God works through people, and people are made effective through prayer. This was not poetry, it was principle. He wrote that God does not anoint plans, he anoints men. He does not empower methods, he empowers hearts that seek him. And prayer, sustained prayer, was the means by which God prepared such men. Bounds was especially severe toward ministers, not because he despised them, but because he loved the calling too much to flatter it. He warned that preaching without prayer produces religious noise, not spiritual awakening. That sermons prepared in study, but not in the secret place, may inform minds, while leaving hearts untouched. That eloquence can never substitute for authority, and authority, he insisted, comes only from intimacy with God. These were dangerous words. They challenged the rising professionalism of ministry. They questioned reliance on education alone. They confronted the temptation to measure success by crowds rather than conversion. Bounds was not anti-learning. He was deeply read and intellectually capable. But he believed that education without prayer created confident men who could explain God without ever having met him. This conviction made his writing uncomfortable and timeless. Yet during his lifetime, almost no one read these words. Bounds published very little. He had no literary ambition. His writings were not marketed. He did not chase distribution. In fact, he seemed almost indifferent to whether his work was ever seen. Why? Because Bounds wrote primarily as an act of obedience, not legacy. His manuscripts were an extension of his prayer life. Writing, like preaching, flowed out of intercession. He believed God was listening long before readers ever would. When he died in 1913, his papers were left behind an organist, unpublished, and largely unknown. It would have been easy for them to disappear entirely, but Providence intervened. Friends and fellow ministers discovered the manuscripts and were stunned. What they found was not devotional fluff, but a sustained theological vision of prayer, clear, forceful, and uncompromising. They recognized something rare, a man who had thought deeply, because he had prayed deeply. After his death, his writings were compiled and published. Titles like Power Through Prayer and The Necessity of Prayer began to circulate quietly at first, then steadily, then globally. And something unexpected happened. Bounds' words found their audience not among the casual, but among the desperate, pastors burnt out by activity, missionaries weary from fruitless labor, believers longing for depth in a shallow religious culture. They recognized the voice. This was not theory. This was not hype. This was truth spoken by a man who had lived it. Bounds did not offer shortcuts. He offered a path and warned that few would walk it. His books did not promise instant results. They promised cost, and yet readers kept returning, because Bounds articulated what many felt but could not name, that the church had learned to function without God's manifest presence and had mistaken survival for success. He insisted that prayerlessness was not a minor weakness, but a fatal flaw, that without prayer, even orthodoxy becomes sterile, that revival is not engineered, it is birthed through travail. Perhaps most confronting was his insistence that the responsibility lay not with God, But with God's people, he rejected the idea that God had withdrawn. Instead, he argued that the church had grown too busy to wait, too confident to kneel, too distracted to seek. This message cut across generations because it exposed a universal temptation to replace dependence with efficiency. Bounds' pen burned because it was lit at the altar. Every page bore the imprint of his 4 a.m. mornings. Every sentence echoed the quiet urgency of a man who believed the church stood at a crossroads, one path paved with activity, the other with prayer. ****. And though he never lived to see the reach of his influence, his words began to do what his prayers had done all along. They awakened consciences. They called ministers back to the secret place. They reminded believers that prayer is not preparation for the battle, it is the battle. They insisted that heaven is still responsive, but only to those willing to linger. Bounds had prayed for decades in obscurity. Now, long after his voice was silenced, his message was being heard, and it was unsettling, because if he was right, if prayer truly was the measure of spiritual power, then much of modern Christianity would need to be re-evaluated. E.M. Bounds did not intend to unsettle the church, but truth has a way of doing exactly that. The deeper his writings spread, the clearer it became that his legacy was not comforting. It was confrontational, not because he attacked doctrine or tradition, but because he exposed something far more unsettling: the possibility that much of what the church calls ministry is being done without God's active power. Bounds believed this was not merely unfortunate, it was catastrophic. At the center of his challenge was a single, unyielding conviction: God's work can only be done by God's power, and God's power is released through prayer. Everything else, no matter how impressive, was secondary at best and counterfeit or worse. This idea threatened the foundations of comfortable faith. It challenged churches that relied on momentum rather than intercession. It unsettled leaders who trusted charisma more than communion. It questioned success measured by attendance instead of transformation. Bounds did not deny the value of organization, education, or strategy, but he insisted they were powerless without sustained prayer. In fact, he warned that the more gifted a minister was, the greater the danger, because talent could mask spiritual emptiness. This is why his writings refuse to age quietly. Every generation discovers that Bounds is not merely describing his era, he is describing theirs. He wrote that prayerlessness often disguises itself as efficiency, that churches fill calendars to avoid the uncomfortable stillness where God might actually speak, that activity becomes a substitute for intimacy. According to Bounds, this drift was not accidental. It was the result of impatience. Prayer requires waiting. Waiting requires humility. Humility requires surrender. And surrender is the one thing modern religion quietly resists. Bounds insisted that prayer exposes the heart in ways preaching never can. In prayer, motives surface, ambitions are laid bare, self-sufficiency is confronted. This is why, he argued, many prefer religious work to spiritual work, because work can be controlled, while prayer cannot. This insight made his message deeply threatening. He argued that revival had never failed because God was unwilling, but because his people were unwilling to pay the price, that God's promises remained intact, but his conditions were ignored, that heaven was silent not from indifference, but from neglect. These claims removed every comfortable excuse. The problem was not culture, not politics, not persecution. The problem, Bounds said, was the prayer life of the church. This was especially devastating for ministers. Bounds believed that ministers set the spiritual temperature of their congregations. If leaders prayed casually, the church would follow. If leaders prayed deeply, the church would awaken. He insisted that no amount of preaching could compensate for a prayerless pulpit. He wrote that God looks not for eloquent mouths, but for consecrated lives, that sermons gain authority from originality, but from proximity to God, that the most powerful moments in ministry often happen unseen long before anyone steps into a pulpit. These ideas were uncomfortable because they shifted responsibility inward. One could no longer blame declining influence on external forces. Bounds placed the weight squarely on the inner life. And yet, his message was not despairing. Beneath the severity was hope, dangerous hope. Bounds believed that if prayer had diminished, it could be restored. If power had faded, it could return. If the church had grown hollow, it could be renewed. But the path back would not be painless. It would require men and women willing to reclaim the secret place. He believed that God still searched for intercessors, people willing to stand in the gap, to labor unseen, to pray when results were invisible. He believed that heaven still responds to such people, not selectively, but faithfully. This belief is what makes his legacy enduring. Bounds did not offer formulas. He offered a call, not to imitate his schedule, but to embrace his seriousness, not to adopt 4 a.m. for its own sake, but to recover priority. His life asked a question no generation can avoid. What would happen if prayer reclaimed first place? And this question remains unsettling, because it cannot be answered theoretically. It demands practice. It demands time. It demands cost. Bounds' legacy threatens comfortable faith because it exposes how little is required to maintain religious appearances and how much is required to touch eternity. Yet, for those willing to listen, his message is not condemnation, it is invitation. An invitation to rediscover power not through innovation, but through devotion, to trade noise for nearness, to exchange activity for authority. Bounds never stood on global stages, but his challenge now reaches the global church. And it leaves us standing at the same crossroads he identified long ago. Bounds never asked to be admired, he asked to be obeyed. And this is why his story does not end with his books, his discipline, or even his astonishing faithfulness. It ends with a question, one that presses uncomfortably close to every generation that encounters his life. What happens if someone actually does this again? Not copies his schedule mechanically, not romanticizes 4 a.m. mornings, but takes prayer with the same gravity. Bounds believed the church's future did not depend on innovation, relevance, or cultural fluency. He believed it depended on whether someone somewhere would be willing to meet God before the world demanded their attention. He insisted that God's pattern had never changed. When heaven moves, it is almost always preceded by hidden intercessors. Before awakenings come prayer meetings that no historian records. Before transformed cities come unknown men and women who refuse distraction. Before public fire comes private agony. Bounds believed that history bends first in the unseen place. This conviction shaped how he understood legacy. He did not measure impact by numbers reached in his lifetime. He measured it by obedience rendered. He trusted that God, not visibility, determines influence. That faithfulness delayed is not faithfulness denied. And time proved him right. Bounds' influence did not explode, it spread quietly, persistently, crossing denominations, cultures, and centuries. His words found pastors on their knees late at night. They found missionaries alone in hostile lands. They found believers exhausted by shallow religion and hungry for depth. But his greatest legacy was not what he wrote. It was what he believed possible. Bounds believed that prayer could still shake heaven, that God was still attentive, that divine power had not retreated, it had merely been neglected. This belief stands in sharp contrast to modern resignation. Today, many have quietly adjusted expectations. Revival is spoken of nostalgically. Power is redefined as influence. Prayer is reframed as therapy rather than warfare. The miraculous is tolerated in theory, but rarely expected in practice. Bounds would not accept this. He would argue that diminished expectation is not humility, it is unbelief dressed as realism. That prayerlessness often masquerades as maturity. That skepticism about God's intervention says more about our prayer lives than God's willingness. And here is where his challenge becomes deeply personal, because Bounds did not live in a time of smartphones, relentless notifications, or algorithm-driven distraction. Yet even then, he believed prayer required intentional resistance. How much more now? To pray seriously today requires swimming against the current. It means choosing silence in a culture addicted to noise. It means choosing depth in a world rewarded for speed. It means waking early or staying late not because it feels spiritual, but because it is costly. Bounds believed cost was the point. He wrote that God is not impressed by what costs us nothing, that prayer offered from convenience rarely carries weight, that intercession, like sacrifice, must touch something precious. This is why 4 a.m. mattered, not because of the hour, but because it represented first place. Bounds gave God his clearest mind, his quietest hour, his strongest attention, and he believed that ordering was decisive. What would happen if someone today did the same? Bounds believed heaven would respond not because the person was exceptional, but because God is faithful. He insisted that God does not play favorites with prayer, that the same access remains open, that the same promises still stand. The only variable is willingness, willingness to linger, willingness to labor unseen, willingness to endure silence without quitting. Bounds believed most people never discover the depths of prayer because they are denied access, but because they leave too soon. He wrote that prayer must be pursued past boredom, past dryness, past self-consciousness, that only then does it move from duty to delight, from monologue to communion. This belief reframes spiritual power entirely. Power, according to Bounds, is not seized, it is entrusted, and it is entrusted to those who have proven they value God more than results. This is why his life still confronts us, not because we are less sincere, but because we are more distracted. Not because we love God less, but because we protect our time more. Bounds would not condemn this, but he would question it. He would ask whether our busyness is producing fruit that eternity recognizes, whether our efficiency has replaced expectancy, whether our prayers have become brief because our faith has become thin. And then he would return us to the altar, not to guilt but to possibility, because Bounds believed that the church is never more than one praying generation away from renewal, that decline is not permanent, that dryness is not destiny, that heaven has not changed pasture, only the church is, and somewhere, even now, his question hangs in the silence before dawn. Who will meet God when no one else is watching? Who will pray not for image, but for invasion? Who will labor not for platform, but for presence? Who will believe not theoretically, but practically that prayer still shakes heaven? E.M. Bounds did not shake heaven because he was extraordinary. He shook heaven because he was available, because he was faithful, because he kept showing up long before sunrise year after year, when nothing visible seemed to happen, and heaven noticed. The final truth of his life is this: God is still listening at 4 a.m. The question is not whether heaven is willing. The question is whether anyone is willing to rise. E.M. Bounds never shook heaven with a microphone, a movement, or a moment of fame. He did it in silence before dawn on his knees. For over 40 years, he proved that the deepest spiritual power is forged where no one is watching. His life stands as a quiet rebuke to shallow faith and a living invitation to something more, something costly, hidden, and real. Bounds reminds us that God has not grown distant. Heaven has not closed its doors. The problem has never been God's willingness to act, but humanity's willingness to wait, to kneel, and to persist. Prayer still moves heaven. Revival is still possible. Power still flows through surrendered lives. The question is no longer what God can do, but who is willing to seek him when it costs everything. If this story stirred something in you, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs renewed hunger for God. And tell us in the comments what challenged you most about E.M. Bounds' life of prayer.